weather standpoint and kind of where I think we're going, as we go into 2023, which I know is it's a very tough question to answer in terms of a lot of things, not just the weather, but also in terms of production. But when we came into this situation, and by situation I'm saying drought, about 3 years ago, at least the newest version of it, there were some things that looked bad along the way. And in many cases, we knew it was going to be somewhat prolonged. We just didn't necessarily know how long. And even last year at this time, it looked like things were going to change, but that wasn't the case. But this year, there are a lot more signs that it is going to change, and I think the situation is at least more optimistic this year than we were at this time last year, but that's kind of where I'm going with my presentation. But before I get down to some nitty-gritty stuff, I kind of need to start with the bigger picture. And for those of you that have seen me talk about this, pardon me if I'm boring you, but for those of you that haven't seen this particular graph, I think it is one of the more important things that I show. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, well, this is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation since 1854. And the PDO, for short, is basically an oceanic and atmospheric oscillation in the Pacific that fluctuates on the order of about every 25 to 35 years. And you can see in the graph right there, the blues and the reds. Well, the blues, that's when the Pacific is in a colder or negative state. And when you see the reds, that's what's in a warmer or more positive state. And the types of weather, not only short-term but long-term, that those changes provide are very linear to us here, whether it's in New Mexico or Texas or western Oklahoma, southwest Kansas, even up here to my backyard in the eastern Colorado, it's very applicable. So on the long view, that's what it looks like over the past, say, almost 170 years. Now, for the past 25 years, that's what it's looked like. And for those of you that may be scratching your heads thinking, man, it used to always rain from the late 70s through the 80s and even into the 90s. But boy, when we got into the 2000s, it really started to change. Well, that's because long about 1998, which is over here on the left side of the graph, the Pacific changed phase. And it went to a negative or a cold state in the PDO. And you can see right there for the past quarter century, we have a lot more blue on that graph than there is red. And that's because that's the predominant phase that it's been in. And even over here on the right side of the graph, you can see that really for about the past 3 years, we've been solidly negative PDO. And in some cases, some of those indices have rivaled what we saw even back in the 1950s. So let's narrow it down a little more here for the past 3 years. Okay? And you can clearly see that trend. But something that's very interesting to me is what's gone on here recently. If you look over there on the far right side of the graph, you see that we were quite negative until January's reading came out. And we started to come back up toward not neutral territory just yet, just a lot less negative. We almost cut that negativity in half just by 1 month right there. And I think that is really important. So while La Nina and El Nino get all the publicity, it's like, man, we need this La Nina to get out of here. It's not about just the La Nina. And I've been saying this for a long time, that the PDO governs a lot of things that we see here in terms of longer range weather, aside from just La Nina and El Nino. So if that PDO is in a negative or a cold state, we struggle a lot of the time regardless if we are in El Nino or a La Nina episode. In fact, the precipitation anomalies for the past 25 years, from January through December, and I've looked back through 25 years of this, okay, wherever you're seeing the yellows and the reds and the oranges, that's where it's been drier than average for the past 25 years. So we should be drier than average with this particular state. California's had problems. Oregon's had difficulty. And right up the center part of the country, from southeast Texas all the way into southern South Dakota, when that PDO is negative, we struggle with dryness. In fact, the only wetter than average places have been over there in the eastern Corn Belt and on up into the Northeast for the past 25 years that we've been dealing with that. So if you look at where we've been the past year with these precipitation anomalies, okay, get a good visual of that right there. I'm going to go back one graphic, right there. All of that red, brown, white, whatever, is precipitation anomalies that are drier than average. All right. So again, for the past year, it should have been dry in those places per history. And I use a lot of history for this kind of stuff because it's an excellent teacher. But you can see plainly western New Mexico had a good monsoon. Eastern New Mexico, not so much. West Texas, not much at all. Central Texas, there are deficits running on the order of 10 to 20 inches below average for the past year. On up into southwest Kansas, some of the driest country in the whole United States is up in southwest Kansas right now. So those areas have a lot of fixing to do. It doesn't just turn around overnight. There's a lot of fixing to do right there. One of the good things that's happening is that the La Nina is starting to really go away. In that oval-shaped area right there that I have, that's where we look to see if there's an El Nino or La Nina happening. If it's La Nina, you see the blue right there. Those are ocean temperatures that are cooler than average. But when you start to see the yellows and the reds, that's when things are changing. And if you look over there in the far western Pacific, right off the west coast of South America, you see plenty of yellows, oranges, and reds where there was once nothing but a lot of blue. And we did not see this happen last year at this time. We saw it start to go away a little bit, and then things came roaring right back in February and especially March, and we dealt with crazy wind and everything. It was full-blown La Nina. This La Nina is going away, and it is starting to rapidly go away in certain places, which I think is great, you know. But as I said, it's not all about just this specific element of the longer range forecast. Okay, so let's look at what the forecast is here for seasonal for the March sea surface temperature anomaly forecast. This is from the Euro seasonal model. And you can see right there, it's picked things up quite nicely. You see the yellows and the oranges extending off the west coast of South America, and a lot of the blue that's out there right now is being forecast to go away as we head into March. The other place that I want you to look at is in the North Pacific, all right, across the Gulf of Alaska and down the west coast of the U.S. You see that there's average to cooler than average water right there in kind of a horseshoe-shaped pattern, if you will. That basically, if you look at that from Anchorage to Seattle, down the west coast, and then back out here near Hawaii, you see that white and blue shaded area and almost like a horseshoe. That is what a negative or a cold PDO looks like. Okay? So I want you to watch these two areas because it's very important how they work in tandem and kind of change. So let's look at the next graphic, which is going to take us deeper into spring. I believe it's going to be coming up here with May to see what kind of changes that were forecast there. Because if you're believing that this thing is going away, well, then you should continue to see big changes. And this is the May forecast. Look at how much different that looks. Here where you've got all of this yellow, orange, and red extending off the west coast of South America. You've got yellows out here where there was once blues. The negatives up here next to the coast of the U.S. are starting to go away. And again, so it's not only just the El Nino's going, or the La Nina's going away, and it looks like we're going toward El Nino, but that North Pacific is changing. And that's really what's important, because by July, look at how much different it looks right there. That North Pacific is warmed. That cold horseshoe, if you will, is gone. We're probably, if this model is correct, already in El Nino at that point, although it may be a little bit fast. I think it has the right idea. So the main message here is that the Pacific Ocean, which has been locked in this phase, that's been a detrimental one for a lot of us over the past 3 years, is changing. And you might ask yourself, well, does this mean it's changing for the next 25 or 30 years? I don't think so, all right? I think this change that's upcoming is just a blip in the longer range pattern, which is yet to fully change. But I know that there's a lot of people that could certainly use that blip to try to fix and get things back on the right track, considering where we've been over the past 3 years or so. So that's the maps that I've just shown you, to me, is a pretty significant reason to be optimistic, at least if nothing else, that the pattern that has locked us in is going away. And if we look at the probabilistic forecast here, okay, this was updated in mid-January. We've got another one coming out here pretty soon. If you look over on the left side, January, February, March, you see that blue bar right there in tandem with the gray bar. Well, that's essentially saying, well, we were in La Nina January, February, but by March we may be at neutral. And then you see those gray bars go way up, and then they come down, and then look what comes up. Those red bars, which indicates El Nino probability, being greater than 50% starting in June, July, August. So as I showed you with that Euro seasonal model right there that had all that warmer than average water materializing, This particular probabilistic outcome is on board with that same line of thinking that not only is La Nina going away and we're going to go right through neutral, but we're likely going to go into El Nino territory. And a lot of times that happens after you come off a big La Nina like what we've been seeing. The atmosphere will overcorrect and go the opposite direction. And in some cases, that's really good news. For others, not necessarily. And here's another piece of good news right here. So over on the left side of your graph, that's a forecast. Starts around February 9th, goes down to February 21st. If you look at the bottom of your graph right there, you can see those numbered areas. 1, 2, 3 over in the Indian Ocean, 4, 5, 6 in what's called the Maritime Continent or Indonesia, and then 7, 8, 1 out here in the far western portion of those El Nino or La Nina regions. Okay, so when you have all of this purple, green, and blue up here that you see, those are easterly trade winds that are very indicative of La Nina, that are basically creating a roadblock out there in the Pacific from the weather pattern cycling like it should, if you will. Okay, the reds right there are westerlies. So once the easterlies fade and go away, the westerlies pick up, and what those westerly trade winds do is they take all of this warmer than average water that's pooled in the western Pacific and it sloshes back to the east. And it essentially helps facilitate the development of the El Nino, and then eventually, if it lasts long enough, it couples to the atmospheric pattern, and that's when you really start to facilitate change. But when I tell you that this graphic has been nothing but blues, greens, and purples in this particular area for the past 2.5 years, that is an understatement. Those trade winds have been ripping out of the east along the equator and has really kept that La Nina locked in place, maintained it, and in some cases developed it even further. So to see these easterly trade winds fade and in some cases completely go away in reverse is another excellent sign that this La Nina its time is just about up. The next 2 weeks, if you're looking for short-term moisture help, well, February is usually a pretty dry month for West Texas and eastern portions of New Mexico, southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, the western High Plains area. But the next 2 weeks, I think we're going to see a nice little uptick in the moisture here across a large part of Oklahoma, East Texas, and the only deficits that are running are out here in western Colorado and parts of the Four Corners area. So even if we were to just get quote-unquote average moisture in the next 2 weeks, that's at least something, okay? But right now, for the next 2 weeks, the wettest weather in the region is definitely going to have an eastern bias with that, which, again, isn't all bad because this problem is regional. It's not just in one particular spot. So if we've got places in the region getting moisture, well, that's a good thing, too, and that's something that we need to look forward to. These new models just came out a couple of days ago. So this is the North American Multi-Model Ensemble precipitation forecast for March. So where you're seeing the white, that is essentially average. The browns, orange, and reds, that's drier than average, and the green and blue, that's where it's wetter than average. So for March, you can see that there's still a pretty healthy dry signal here across the western and southern High Plains. All right, not unprecedented for this, because remember, our PDO is still negative, and we still have La Nina hanging on by a thread. So we haven't completely flipped the script here this month or into March. So what happens in April? Well, in April, we still have some of that lingering signal too, drier than average. And I want to preface this by saying these models initialize themselves when there's a La Nina out there happening right now, even though it's a weakened one. So sometimes these computer models will take that initial signal and project forward, not fully understanding maybe how rapidly things could change, okay? So I don't want you to get all your hope lost on this particular area for both March and April, because it doesn't necessarily mean we're not going to see any storms. It's just hinting at the prospects of it being drier than average, being greater than it being average, or wetter than average, okay? The tell here is what happens in May. And for May, I have seen this model latch on to some of this where that dry signal doesn't completely go away, but boy, it weakens considerably, not just for one particular area, but for the region. And by the time we enter into June, it's largely gone. And we've actually flipped to some wetter than average conditions over southeast Colorado, parts of the panhandles, and we're firmly in the white for the majority of New Mexico. Texas, again, We still have a couple of pockets there that may be a little bit drier than average, but the overall signal is weakening such to where you're allowing other things to happen. The same thing for July when we've got the monsoon starting to tick right there. That dry signal is still somewhat present across parts of Texas, but for other regions, it's not, that it's gone. And then if we look into August, same story. Average to maybe slightly drier than average for some of us, but you also have other areas right there that were drier than average initially that actually finished the season wetter than average. So if nothing else, I'm encouraged by that right there. Let's look at the Euro seasonal model right here. All right, so for March, you can see a lot of drier than average stuff right there over a large part of the Southwest. We've got wetter than average stuff, Northern California, Pacific Northwest, and on up in the Ohio Valley. Again, classic La Nina right there. All right, so if we, and that's not surprising given the way the deck is stacked right now. If we look at April, not a whole lot different for the reasons that I just mentioned a little while ago. If we go to May, well, then things start to change. And the last version of this model, last month, actually had May and June average to wetter than average right there. And we haven't seen some of this stuff show up now for the past, 2.5 years. So I don't necessarily want you to say, well, my house is firmly in the brown. Well, that's not my point here. These models aren't going to be perfect. My point is we are seeing things change in the pattern that's governed us, and we are seeing these models start to respond to that to give us at least a little bit of optimism going forward that we might actually get a little bit of moisture when we could actually use it. And in June, you're looking at very similar conditions here. Look at southwest Oklahoma down through a large part of Texas. There are other areas that might end up average to slightly drier than average, but as I said, don't just necessarily focus on what you're seeing in your particular spot. Focus on what's going on in the broad pattern. And very similar here with July. You can see what it has in July. This particular model says no monsoon. Okay? I'm not ready to sign off on that just yet. You might ask yourself why, and the answer is because this time of year when these models are put out, again, the signal that they are put out in to begin with, if that doesn't change going forward, that gives me confidence that it won't change. But the signal that this was initialized in is going to be a different signal than what this finishes in. And I think that's an important thing to take in mind. And even as we look into August, you can see right there across parts of the Panhandle region, West Texas. And look, if we've got wetter than average stuff happening in some previous months here, I don't think that it's just going to be a complete monsoon failure. Not at this point. We'll have to look at that going forward. But there are some things in the region which, as I said, I'm encouraged by. So let's walk things back a little bit here. Historically speaking, whenever the PDO is negative, these are the precipitation anomalies that we see from February through June. This is from 1948 through 2020. So when the PDO is negative, you see all of the yellow, reds, and oranges right there. That's where history has shown us that it's been drier than average. Where you're seeing the blues and the greens, that's where history has shown us that it's wetter than average. So as I showed you, I'm not ready to just completely sign off and just say everything's going to be great in the near term, simply because the PDO is still negative. It's great that the La Nina is going away. That may help open things up a little bit for us to where we can see something that's more frequent in terms of moisture. But history shows us that until that PDO makes a full-on shift, we can't completely put to bed the drier than average stuff right there. Okay? Let's walk back to late 2013 and 2014, because that's the last time we had a negative PDO transition to neutral and then went to positive. Okay? So October of 2013 over here on the left side, you can see where it was negative, and then we came up here to neutral. We tried to go positive, but we didn't get the job done until the back half of 2014. So again, this stuff doesn't happen overnight, so it's a process. So knowing what we know about the PDO at that time, this is where we were from January through May of 2014, before the PDO fully changed right there. Look at all that drier than average stuff right up the center part of the country. Again, right where it should be when the PDO is negative. We even had California being drier right there. But look, the Pacific Northwest and parts of the Northern Rockies were okay. Upper Midwest did all right in places. But what happened when the PDO neutralized and then went warm? Well, then things changed a great deal. These are precipitation anomalies from June through December of 2014. West Texas moistened up, so did eastern New Mexico, southwest Kansas. Look at some of those anomalies here. The first 5 months of the year, so dry, and then completely flipped to the opposite there during the back part of the year. Okay? And then late in 2014 and 2015, we saw an El Nino materialize, and that's what January through December of 2015 looked like. We had all the moisture in the world across all of the western and southwest high plains. Everything was great again, unless you were out in the far west, where that strong El Nino actually did not do those folks any favors out there. But the farther east you went, we did okay. So that's kind of how historically you pivot on something like this. It doesn't all happen just overnight. It takes a little bit of time, and when you've been locked in something like this, you have to be patient for that to change. I'm not saying you have to like it. I'm just saying you have to be a little bit patient with something like that. So in summary, the La Nina going away is a good thing, all right? The fact that the PDO is still negative but should become less negative in time is also a good thing. This possible phase shift is important in facilitating long-term pattern change. The December reading, okay, of the PDO was negative 2.21. The January reading is negative 1.28. As I said, it came up a lot right there. And as these sea surface temperatures warm out there in the Pacific, I continue to think that it will come up by quite a bit. Maybe not go completely positive until later this year, but at least something more neutral like I showed you that happened from late 13 and 14. El Nino development later this year is not a certainty. It rarely is, but it certainly seems likely based on what I'm seeing. But I want you to keep in mind, because a lot of people say, oh, thank goodness El Nino is coming. Keep in mind, it doesn't necessarily imply immediate relief. And I say, look at the PDO to see if they're working in tandem. Every La Nina is different. Every El Nino is different. So we have to see how the pattern changes here before, in my mind, I can get really excited about some things happening. And if nothing else, the pattern that has continuously caused and reinforced drought looks like it's going to loosen its grip on us. So if nothing else, we'll see something different as always, and it's very important to capitalize on that moisture we receive. So if we start loading things up in May and you really start seeing things change, you have to have your ducks in a row ahead of time to be able to capitalize on that pattern change. All right? I spoke in Lubbock a few weeks ago at the Texas Alliance of Water Conservation, and that was my real message to them. I'm like, look, it's not all unicorns and rainbows and roses for you right now, and you still have a little ways to go through this. But now is the time to make sure you have everything in line, so when you start seeing some regular moisture, you can immediately put things to work and your plan to work, so you're not wasting time, which is wasting the moisture. Because look, that subsoil moisture depleted. It's really depleted. And even a couple weeks ago, when there was some good snow across parts of West Texas, that again, settles the dirt. It's a good thing. Glad to see it. But what does it do for the sub? And what does it do for the surface moisture when you get a cold front blow down from the north and you see wind gusts that are in excess of 50, 60 miles an hour? All right. I'm not talking about short-term change. I'm looking at the bigger picture that needs to change here. And with that, I am cautiously optimistic about this. Again, when you've been as bad as you've been in terms of the moisture, you're always a little bit gun shy that the pattern's going to change. But the history says it's changing. The current conditions say it's changing on multiple levels. So there are a lot of forensics there, to me, that pays attention to a lot of this stuff all the time. That there's some reason for optimism right there. All right. So with that in mind, we can open things up to questions right there, and just fire away if you wish.
So anyone with questions for Brian will need to ask them through this microphone, because it's the only one, at least to my knowledge, that we have that pipes into Zoom. So questions for Brian? Brian, just letting the audience think of some. You got one coming here in just a minute.
Okay, that's fine. Take your time.
Yeah, Brian, I was curious if you have any speculation as to if we do make a positive move, what kind of time frame could we possibly looking at with it staying on a positive?
As far as how long that positive trend will last?
Yes, sir.
So if you look back at history here, the last time we had this little blip was in 2014 through about 2016. All right, and depending on where you are in the western or southwest high plains, we really didn't have moisture problems crop back up again until about 19. All right, so, and there's a reason for that, because if you go through a phase where it's excessively wetter than average, well, you repair the soil, which in turn repairs the vegetation. And if you've got vegetation out there on the ground, that helps to mitigate even the shortest dry spell, because you at least have some subsoil moisture to draw from. So that period of time right there from 14 until about, say, 18, even into 19, that was about a good 4-year period there where we didn't necessarily have a lot of things to worry about. And that's about how long the PDO lasted in a positive fashion. As soon as we kind of came back toward neutral and even south of neutral a little bit, that's when we started having problems. And then we dipped way down in there, starting in 20. And that's what really helped, push us into severe drought. And in some cases, that was worse than back in 11, 12, and 13. So the idea here is you see how this kind of oscillates back and forth, okay? And the recent period of weather that I really like to compare the time that we're in is back in the 50s. You go back and you look at a lot of the things that happened in the 50s and how they happened. Came out of a tremendously bad drought in the mid 50s, but when we got to 57, we saw a little bump in the PDO. We had an El Nino that happened right there, and we had some of the wettest weather turnaround like that for that time. And I think that is possible with something like this, but it just takes time. So if you look back into, say, from late 10 through early 14, that's when you had some really bad times. But from 14 through about 18, even to early 19 for some areas, you did okay. And that's just the nature of where we farm and ranch. It's the extremes. So while this upcoming blip, which I think it could be, may not last for 15 years, I know a lot of folks that would sure take a couple of years of good times as far as the moisture goes. And even if we only see a couple that piggyback on top of this, and it doesn't completely fix things, that's better than where we are right now, which, a lot of folks would probably end up going out of business if we had to keep this going, because that's just the way the world works. So, like I said, I'm always gun shy because, look, the future's hard. So I'm always gun shy about projecting good times when we've had such bad times lately. So my job is to just simply look at the forensics. What have those forensics shown us in the past in terms of doing a pivot here and changing the pattern, and then making the most educated forecast I can going forward. So in terms of the longer term PDO phase, we're about 25 years in here. All right. So there's no magic bullet here for when it's going to change, and it changes over time. But historically speaking, the PDO lasts on the average in a particular phase for about 30 years. So even if we go to a short-term wet period here, there's nothing to say that we can't go back until that PDO long-term pattern changes for the good. The blip's nice, but I want the longer term to show up so we don't have to worry about capitalizing on just a blip.
Other questions for Brian? We got one. It's going to take me a minute to get there, Brian, so hang tight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem.
I was concerned about getting some ideas about the expected temperatures for the next year or so, considering that we're expecting a little better rainfall. I remember back in the 50s with the drought where it was very hot, and then we had the break in the drought of 57, 58. Back in then, things cooled off dramatically, and I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also about the expected winter moisture.
Winter meaning the rest of the winter?
No, I was thinking about the coming up winter moisture.
well, a couple of things about that. First to address your temperature question, until we put moisture in the soil and get some vegetation back on the soil, the idea of seeing warmer than average temperatures is a good one. All right. Now, when we get moisture back in the soil and when it starts raining a lot more regularly, then yes, we will likely go back into at least an average, if not below average trend right there, because historically speaking, when this pattern pivots, it really pivots. You know, we rarely go from, oh, we're coming out of drought, and oh, the drought lessens a little bit, and oh, we get a little bit of moisture. No, it doesn't usually work like that. It usually goes from we're not getting anything to we actually have more than we need right now. So when that pattern change happens, then yes, I think once the soil cures, we get vegetation, then we can start talking about things likely being cooler than average. Historically speaking, El Nino winters are wet in the southern high plains. That is a signal that is very prominent. And if we can see this El Nino fully materialize, that will be something that I'm on board with for the fall and as we head into winter. So it'd be a 23-24 type thing, you know, in terms of that. So I hope that answered your questions there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? We've got him on the hook all the way from Colorado, so let's take advantage of it.
So, Brian, this is Andy Holloway from Canadian. I bought a set of cows I bought a set of cows about 20 years ago out of New Mexico that had been advertised as 4-year-olds and never been rained on. So do you think that these ranchers that are here today can begin to start retaining their heifer calves that are being born now? A lot of these herds are depleted. They've had to sell out, sell down, and it's all a function of moisture and not having any grass and forage. Do you think it's reasonable that this spring calf crop, especially the heifer calves, are going to have enough grass to eat in a big region because of the moisture that you're kind of thinking over the next few years of time, so that these ranchers can get back on their feet with their cow herds and their stocking rates?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at history, that what you had to deal with coming out of the major drought in 2015. Had all the grass, had all the water we wanted, but there were no cows to eat it. And I've been listening to enough from the ag economy side of things to know that that's a very real concern going forward, because with herds being so depleted, you have to make that decision. And unfortunately, you have to make that decision on something as fickle as the weather. So I think it's a very complicated answer is what I'm getting to. What are your grazing practices? Do you have any, how much hay do you have that can possibly help mitigate some dry time before we fully start to see better moisture? How overextended are you on your books? You see there are elements here where the weather is important, yes, but it's a broader question to what is the state of your business? What can you absorb? Can you absorb to have those calves out there if you don't have all the grass that you want, just to make sure you have some present when the pattern actually starts going? I think that's a question that you have to ask yourself from a business standpoint, and then you have to see what the weather's going to do. As I told the folks in Lubbock a few weeks ago, I'm like, look, the snow that you're going to get is good. Don't get me wrong. But I said, is it something to be just all in excited about? No. Probably not, because even in some of the driest times, we will see storms blow through. And if you're one of the lucky ones that's able to get some moisture when no one else isn't, that's another element of the equation right there. You know, if you're on this little island and you're getting moisture and you have calves that are doing just fine, maybe you're completely different than your neighbor down the road a couple of miles. So my best advice is you've got to know what your business is like first. All right? Know what you can absorb from a risk standpoint. Also, know what you can absorb going forward before the pattern fully changes. Don't be optimistic completely about that first rain that you get, all right? You need to make sure you're getting regular moisture before you can actually get excited and really kick it into gear, and then you know what you can exactly do. So I know a lot of people are going through those hard decisions and having to ask themselves some hard questions, but Isn't that what farming and ranching in the western and southern High Plains is all about?
I've got a
You know?
question. If climate change goes like some have predicted, what's the future of ranching in the Southwest with the change in the climate?
Well, I guess it depends on what's important to you. Okay, so whether you agree with what is changing with the climate or you disagree with it or whatever, water is always going to be a problem, whether it's coming from the sky or coming out of the ground. And that's the message that I was trying to also discuss in Lubbock a few weeks ago is like, look, take Lubbock, Texas, for example. You've got folks moving out of the city and going out on the outskirts, and they've got a little bit of property right there. Maybe they built a house, and the hole they punch in the ground for the well, when they first punch it, is a 10-gallon-a-minute well. But then you have a neighbor that moves in, and there goes another straw into your drink. And now your 10-gallon-a-minute well is now a 5-gallon-a-minute well. Whether this climate thing, whatever you want to make of it, okay, is going to dramatically change climate in your lifetime and maintain it. See, that's the key. I knew a lot of folks that never thought it was going to rain again in Texas back in 2011. And then we get to 2015, and then everybody that said that completely forgot all about what they said, all right? Because everybody's memory is only about 15 minutes long now anyway. So I think it's more of a water question. Are you set up for water? Do you think the Ogallala Aquifer is going to be readily recharged? No. I'm 48 years old. That's not going to be recharged in my lifetime or my kid's lifetime. There is no way. However, let's look at something tangible in a historical sense right here, all right? When that PDO warms and we fully see that change, look back through history and what that has meant. In many cases, that has meant some really good times for a sustained period of time. So I think that that's something that we have to monitor. Does that change the water situation? In my mind, no. Okay? You got all these people that are around, and they're all doing water, and everybody needs water, and what's going to change that? Nothing. You got to know how to manage your water. And if you don't have any water, you need to go find some place where there is. I had that conversation with folks here up in the Arkansas River Basin about 10 years ago because they were squawking about water problems. And I'm like, look, do you think that situation is going to get any better? You have more straws going into the drink, taking more water out. That is not going to change. So it's a complex answer to a question that is out there. And I've told some folks before, I'm just like, look, move. I grew up farming and ranching. I'm going to have to make these hard decisions myself when that decision that my folks make gets put onto me. What do you want to do? Well, who wants to sell their legacy ranch? You know, nobody wants to do that. But who wants to try to make it work when you can only get enough moisture to make it work 2 years out of 10? To me, that is a bad business model. And from the start, when I started my private business doing this 20 years ago, I walked into a group of cattlemen and I said, you can't be emotional about your animals. You can't be emotional about your land. Because when you do that, inevitably it's going to cost you money and potentially your livelihood. So that may not be a popular answer, but that's my answer.
Time for one last question for Brian. All right, not seeing any. Brian, want to thank you quite a bit for spending this part of the afternoon with us. Let's thank Brian.
My pleasure, folks. If you have any questions, concerns, if there's anything I can do for you or your business, as I said, that's my card right there. I'd be more than happy to. So just drop me a line, send me a text, give me a call, and we'll put something together. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Brian.